So we've called this session the bucket list, 15 things every investor should know before they leave this room. Now, I thought long and hard how to introduce this session, and I came up with the following. Most of the people in this room, I'm sure, have heard stories, jokes that start off with an Englishman, an Irishman, and Scotsman. Well, we at MBAD think that's a bit passé, so we've got to get rid of it. So we left the Scotsman because they're a bit touchy-feely, sensitive, delicate, right? So we left the Scotsman and we added 2 Indians because we think that's a bit more representative of what's going on in the world today. So we have a Scotsman and 2 Indians talking about 15 things that you should all know before you leave the room. Now, what can I tell you about the 3 people in the panel here today? Well, let's start with one of the Indians. You just met him, Vikram Mansharamani. He's lecturer at Yale, a senior fellow at Harvard. And between you and me, he's written a few papers in his time. He's written a book called Boom-bustology. And look, between you and me, anyone that can come up with a title like Boom-bustology is a pretty cool dude, okay? Now, the second person we have is Ashish Thakkar. Ashish Thakkar is founder of Mara Group. He's a very successful entrepreneur. He's the doer here, right? He's the wheeler dealer. And he has been voted by, or nominated by, the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. And we have him here because he knows a thing or two about Africa. So that leaves the Scotsman. Now, the Scotsman has got to be the only Scotsman on the planet who's written a book on austerity. He's probably the only Scotsman that can spell austerity, right? So anyway, he kind of knows about austerity. He's also got a couple of opinions on why countries in Europe are completely screwed because they have no idea what to do with their budgets or their money. So, gents, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Siobhan. So, thrilled again to be here. I think we have some slides that we're going to put up here. We'll make sure we have it to keep everyone on. Let's see. Okay. In any case, look, we're going to change this. Okay. So, let's go back. There we go. All right. Well, because Mark here, as Siobhan just said, wrote a book about financial accountability and why it's a bad idea. No, austerity. He calls it austerity. I call it financial accountability and sort of staying within your budget. But Mark doesn't think that's a good idea. So anyway, the team at the National Bank of Abu Dhabi said, how can we put a person like him in charge of counting to 15? It's unlikely. If we give him the floor and give him control of the clicker, we'll end up with 80 ideas in 5 hours, and it's not going to work out. So that left Ashish and me. The problem with Ashish is he's a big thinker, attacking big markets. The last time he counted to 15, I think he was taking a break from founding the Mara Group to count the number of candles on his birthday cake. He now concerns himself with 50-plus countries, employs thousands of people, targets billions of consumers, and has hundreds of millions in revenue. I think the National Bank of Abu Dhabi team feared that Ashish would be bored counting to 15 here on this planet. Lastly, because the National Bank of Abu Dhabi does everything thoroughly and with great conviction, they went in search of someone who could count to 15 perfectly, who wouldn't go higher, who wouldn't go lower, and who would stay on time. That person, of course, was unavailable. And so they went looking for others, and they found me. Perhaps because of my PhD from MIT, I was able to stand out among the resumes that were submitted, many of which I believe were from kindergartners. So, let me begin the session and humbly suggest that we change the title from the bucket list. This is not really what the session's going to be about. I've spent time with both Mark and Ashish. I understand what we're going to talk about. I think this is actually all wrong, so let's just change it. We're going to call it the kitchen sink. 15 ideas that may actually confuse every investor in this room. We've changed it from Mark, Vikram, and Ashish to the thinker, the advisor, and the doer. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Ashish and let him start with his 5 points. We're going to keep it very quick, and we'll move on from there.
Thank you very mumuch. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Clearly, the National Bank of Abu Dhabi is not happy with my banking relationships and hence have put me on a panel with 2 professors. So it's a great start. Africa is now. I mean, we have presence in 22 countries, but the continent 54 countries, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. The fact that we've been able to leapfrog. As Africa, we don't have legacy systems. We went from, rather than creating landlines, straight to mobile telephony. We've got more mobile phone users than Western Europe and the whole of the US. We then leapfrogged in terms of mobile money. Today, having money on your phone in a village in Kenya is normal, which is unusual in the West. So, I mean, we've been able to leapfrog. The fact that we don't have legacy systems gives us that ability. And we are 54 countries. However, obviously, regional integration is playing a key role. Earlier, Alex referred to it. The East African community is a great case in point, but we've got so much regional integration programs going on, which is increasing the inter-Africa trade, which I think is another crucial element.
Perfect. I'll be very curious to hear if Mark is able to justify whether there's any reason we should think about Europe now. So, okay, let's keep going then. So your second point?
Don't generalize. You know, I mean, we all know theoretically there are 54 countries on the continent. The big issue we have is that we still are generalized. I'll give you a case in point. Ebola. We had Ebola on the continent. We're left with Ebola in 3 countries. Yet, the entire continent is generalized. The Ebola epicenter is closer to London than it is to Kenya, yet Kenya had lots of cancellations during Christmas. It just shows you that the ignorance is still a big issue. Mark and I were discussing earlier about Kenya's security. And when you think about Kenya's security, Kenya fought, you know, in Somalia fighting global terrorism. And when they did, the Al-Shabaab hit back, and one of our shopping malls got affected. Immediately, the West puts, you know, red alerts saying, do not travel to Kenya. France had a little bit of an issue, and everybody went there, stood in solidarity, walking the streets in a line. And that's the issue that we have. We are generalized in a very negative context, which needs to change.
Sure. So 50 Shades of Africa? Maybe another bestseller? Possibly. A good movie,
Could
right?
be.
So we can sell these? This is be lovely. Good. Okay. Ashish is an entrepreneur. He can help make this happen. Okay. Next point.
Local and global. I mean, local and global is very crucial. You know, the fact that all of our countries are extremely unique. My partner, Bob Diamond, and I partnered. Bob is a global banker, an absolute legend in what he does and what he has created in the past, has a real passion for Africa. The Mara Group understands the continent extremely well. We set up a business called Atlas Mara, listed it on the London Stock Exchange. We're oversubscribed and today own banks in 7 countries across Africa. Majority of our capital came in from the US, and majority of that capital never invested in Africa before, which shows you that there's a huge appetite to invest, but they need to know how. And I think the whole combination of local and global is absolutely crucial so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel and global companies can plug in very easily.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there. This is not fair. We have sponsors for this event that are paying to get advertising time. He's saying local and global. Let's be honest. The Mara Group is one of the few companies that actually has breadth of local experience. So this is not fair. There are sponsors who are paying, but he's advertised. Anyway, Mara Group
and there are
knows
people who
best.
are doing.
Let's keep going. Okay.
Increasing transparency. I mean, look, I have been personally active on the continent. My family has been in Africa for over 125 years. I personally have been active on the continent for the last 18 and a half years. I act as an advisor to 4 heads of state on the continent. I work very closely with the Africa Development Bank. I sit on the Global Agenda Council for Africa for the World Economic Forum. I see it firsthand. Our leaders want to leave behind a positive legacy. I'm seeing that they're a lot more passionate about youth entrepreneurship, about creating the right type of employment. And this is amazing. The transparency that we have seen when Bob and I bought these banks, it's a highly regulated industry. We got approvals from central bank governors and governments in record time. You wouldn't be able to do this in the West. Again, it's a perception versus reality issue. We have 4,000 employees in Nigeria. We're very active there. I'm there every 4 weeks. Yet the perception versus reality doesn't match up to it. We have increasing transparency.
Okay, so maybe I'm expressing my ignorance here, but it sounds like now I'm going to be able to see the corruption, the transparency. Do I really want to know? Let's be honest. I mean, wasn't it more fun to invest in Brazil before we knew of all the corruption? We made more money. It was sort of a better place. But actually, you know, I do teach business ethics, so if this is being recorded, we should strike that from the record, actually. I teach business ethics. Actually, I fully agree. Transparency is a good thing. Great.
It's the issue of being with professors on the panel.
Yep.
Youth demographics. 80% of our population is under the age of 35. We have such a young population. And, You know, the Mara Foundation, our nonprofit, is very active on the continent, focusing on enabling, empowering, and inspiring young entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs. We actually launched the program in the UAE with the Emirates Foundation as well. And we've got about 570,000 entrepreneurs that we support on the continent. The entrepreneurial spirit, the drive, the energy that the youth have on the continent is just unbelievable. And frankly, we keep on talking about unemployment being an issue, and it is an issue. But the answer to unemployment, especially youth unemployment, is not foreign direct investment or large-scale projects. It is actually nurturing these small and medium enterprises in the right way. And it's such an exciting time just to see our continent booming. One amazing fact was that Nigeria had more babies born last year than the whole of Western Europe. It baffles your mind, but it is the future in that respect.
And I know, speaking of the youth, or the forever youthful, President Mugabe on the African continent just celebrated his
91st
birthday. Lovely.
And actually on his 90th birthday, it was actually quite funny. I mean, on his 90th birthday, a journalist actually asked, you know, when are you going to say bye to your people? And he kind of jumped up on his seat saying, where are they going?
Yep. Lovely. Youthful Africa. Okay. So let's turn to Mark, just in the interest of time. I think, Mark, your first point was you're calling it the hedge.
The hedge, exactly. So being the non-parsimonious Scot who studies Europe, I thought I would think like a trader trying to build a portfolio and see if that was any fun. As you know, Europe's having a few problems with sovereign debt just now. So if you're worried about that, what would be the hedge? How would you anchor your portfolio? I would say buy the long-term debt of German industrial firms. I know this doesn't sound sort of intuitive or exciting, but let me explain why. It's because they last longer than most countries. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. BASF Chemicals was founded in 1865. Krupp's, who make appliances, still today is still very good, 1846. ThyssenKrupp Metalworks, 1891 and 1811. Siemens Engineering, who make rather nice trains, 1847. These companies have survived, inter alia, the 1848 revolutions, the unification of Germany, the long deflation of the end of the 19th century, World War I, Versailles, occupation, hyperinflation, hyperdeflation, fascism, the partition of the country into two parts, communism, reunification, globalization, and the euro. They are unkillable. Seriously, buy some of their debt, because you know what? Your great-grandchildren will still be taking a positive carry off it long after we're all gone. Okay, so what's the risk-on trade?
Next.
The risk-on trade is go long yen. I can hear you laughing already. Now, this is an unfashionable call, but I'll explain why I think this is real. A friend of mine who's a hedge fund manager started going to Japan in the early 1990s, just after they had the real estate implosion. Got off the train in Osaka and went to the local yakitori shop in the train station. It was delicious. He had lunch there. It cost 300 yen. He goes back every single year for the next 20 years. He always goes to the train station. He always goes to the yakitori shop. It's still 300 yen. Now, if you're an investor, this is a disaster. Why would you want to invest there? But if you're an old person, and Japan has an awful lot of old people, and you're on a fixed income, this is heaven on earth. You don't consume too much. You save too much. When the government gives you money, you save even more. So growth and local interest rates are both very much on the decline. Now think about Abe's three arrows policy. Is this really going to turn Japan into a high consumption, high growth economy? No, the demographics are all wrong. But what it will do is make for a massive asset and currency distortion that will support a very nice and smooth deflationary glide path amongst a population that uses public debt as an intragenerational gift. Eventually, they will eat the entire capital stock of the country, but in the meantime, their currency is going to be artificially high. The long short. There's a short out there. We don't know when it's going to happen. But like comedy, it's all in the timing. It's about mean reversion of GDP in Europe. There's a guy you've probably heard of called Thomas Piketty. He's written a few things about inequality. But the most interesting part of his book is chapters 2 through 5, where he reformulates Robert Solow's growth theory. The bottom line is Europe's looking at 1.2 to 1.4 4% growth of GDP going forward in a good year. Now, they have a lot of debt. And the more that you cut, as Greece has proven, it seems to be the more you shrink your economy and the same constant stock of debt gets bigger rather than smaller. So the best way to get rid of debt is to inflate your way out of it. You basically make sure that your central bank and your banks are filled with these bonds. You drop the coupon, you reissue the debt, you run a positive inflation, and as if by magic, a third of your debt disappears in 10 years. The only problem is Europe's old. They don't consume enough. They send each other savings and recycle them through these bond markets. And the long short works like this. Your rate of growth in GDP is too low. Your rate of growth in your debt is too high. Your rate of growth in your investment is too low. Add all that together, and at some point, Mario Draghi's promise to do whatever it takes will be tested. At that point, get your shorts on. Now, of course, in any strategy such as this or portfolio such as this, you have to watch out for tail risk. And the tail risk that comes here is the politics of deflation, which I like to call bond-friendly and investor-unfriendly. Now, why is this? Well, if you're lucky enough to have Japan's deflationary glide path, very nice and long and steep until you eat the entire capital stock of the country, it's nice. But if you're Greece and you've already lost 25% of GDP and you find yourself deflating, this gets ugly very quickly. Why? If you have an inflation, this is basically a tax on paper investment. It hits investors first. They tend to band together very quickly and demand relief from the government, hence why we have independent central banks and so on and so forth. But in deflation, it's very different. Your first best action to protect yourself, it often brings about second best consequences. If you're labor and you want to price yourself into a job, that's individually rational. But if everyone takes a wage cut at the same time to do this, in the aggregate, that reduces consumption. So the politics that you get in deflationary circumstances, particularly in battered economies, tends to be very, very unpredictable, very, very investor-unfriendly. Look at Greece and look at the rest of Europe in the periphery. That's where that's going. And finally, the long equity play. Demographics, as we know, and Ashish has reminded us, matter. But for Europe, it matters the other way around because they're all old. America is almost as bad. So here's what you do. Go long healthcare in big pharma in the developed world. Let me finish with a quick story. I took a train from Boston to New York 2 weeks ago. It was the day after a big snowstorm. It took me 8 hours to get there. The electricity failed on the train. There was no food. There was no water. It was awful. But even in the best of times, the regional train, the Amtrak from Boston to New York, takes 4.5 hours to travel 203 miles, which means that it travels at an average speed of 45 miles an hour. This is America. There are trains in India with people and possibly animals on the outside of them that are more reliable and faster than Amtrak. So why is US infrastructure so unbelievably awful? And why is capital investment so low? Because of what I like to call the greediest generation, the baby boomers. Some of you are here. It's your fault. They're starting to retire now, and they're the only generation in human history that has increased its consumption as it retires, while the active labor force behind them shrinks and has lower than ever wages. Money, therefore, shifts out of equity into fixed income, and investment falls further. And they all want to live forever. Rather than having one catastrophic illness, such as a smoking-related disease, which would take them out for minimal health care costs, we can now look forward to 50 million obese, dementia-ridden, hypertensive, 3-time hip replacements, spending 12 to 15% of GDP a year on health care for the next 15 to 20 years until they slip the mortal coil. The result, like the Japanese, they too will eat the entire capital stock of the country. But in the meantime, go long healthcare and big pharma. After all, as John Dillinger, the bank robber, said about banks, that's where the money is. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Entertaining as always. I'm going to try to go through very quickly the 5 points I wanted to make. The first is, when we talk about demographics in the world, and we talk about this population boom that's happening, you have to ask where it's happening. It's not happening in the US, it's not happening in Europe, it's not happening in Russia, and in fact, President Putin may be accelerating the decline of that population. It's not happening in China. They had a one-child policy. And it's for sure not happening in Japan. And so when we look across the world, you have to ask, where is this population boom? And it so happens to be that most of the population boom is happening in Africa and India. And these are some of the fastest growing countries in the world. The point I want to make here is when population collides with income, people change what they do. They go from having a bowl of rice to a bowl of rice with chicken on top, a bowl of rice with chicken and beef, or pork, or fish, etc. As they add animal protein, that will put pressure on the entire value chain for animal protein. And that means that there will be increasing pressure for grains, there'll be increasing pressure for water and a lot of the fertilizers that go into supporting the grains, and I believe the whole agricultural value chain becomes very interesting. And so I would suggest getting long protein or fertilizer or anything in this value chain. Number two, China slows. I think we discussed this in the panel before, so I don't need to belabor the point, but it still grows. Look, this is a large economy that even if it were to grow at 5% a year, which I understand is lower than most people believe, still takes lots of people, hundreds of millions of people from poverty-stricken lives into the middle class. They will consume, they will eat protein, they will drive cars, they will demand refrigerators and air conditioning. So I think that still happens. Third, India is now. I think this is an interesting one. We talked about it again on the panel before. Prime Minister Modi coming and taking a country that has been leaning in socialist or has had socialist tendencies and moving it towards capitalist tendencies. Doing business in India has historically been one of the most difficult places to do business. In any ranking of doing business, they end up in the bottom 10 to 15 percentile of all countries on the planet. They're working on changing that. I think if they succeed and make it a business-friendly environment, India has the potential to be the fastest-growing large economy in the world. I think that's highly possible, and I think it's on the path to going there. So I believe India is now.
But I think, let's just be clear, I think the Africa is now came first. So let's just remember that.
And just in case there's any confusion out there, Europe is done.
Yeah.
So that would be the sequence we'll go with.
Yes. All right, so robots. I believe this field of robotics and automation that's taking over a large portion of manufacturing is a fascinating development that we all need to pay attention to for a couple reasons. Number one, robots are a highly deflationary force. They allow us to do more with less and lower prices. This is not good for labor. This is not good for those seeking to have income, at least in the part of the world that Mark seems to focus on, which is those that are seeking more incomes. So robotics is a real concern. As a quick example and a story, there is a Panasonic facility in Japan that today produces 20 million flat screen TVs, up to, I think the largest one is 103 inches. A huge facility. I think it produces somewhere between 10 and 15% of all flat panel TVs made in the world. The number of employees it utilizes, 25. 25 employees produce roughly 20 million flat panel TVs every month. This is because of robotics and the automation. I ask you, when that dynamic is underway and you have that kind of development, what is the value of putting factories in places where you have cheap labor? It's not. That's not what you would do. You would put your factory next to its source of demand. The transportation and logistics become a larger component of the final value delivered than the production or the labor component of production. So robotics. Now this is also true in drones and what that may do to transportation, delivery, and logistics. This is a sector I think we need to pay attention to and watch. Lastly, I know Mark talked about Greece and how Europe was having some difficulties, let's say the least. One of the things I learned in my study of financial bubbles, booms and busts, was one of the most profitable times to invest is immediately following a massive devaluation. A massive, massive devaluation. So if you looked at Indonesia, following the currency's devaluation by 90-some-odd% in late 1998, you could have purchased anything in Indonesia, in Indonesian rupiah terms, and it nominally would have appreciated and made you a ton of money. So my solution here, if you are given the opportunity to buy a Greek island in drachma terms, do so. It will be one of your most profitable investments, I think, ever. And I think, as the professors, of course, we will happily be the caretakers of this island for you.
And in fact, if I sort of eyeball out here, I can basically see about maybe 1,200 people. So statistically then, there's about 12 of you, if we go right out into the tail, that probably want to be a James Bond supervillain. I mean, just statistically, in any large group, there's a certain number of people who'd like to be a James Bond supervillain. And you can't do that unless you have an island.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's part of the job description. So really pay attention to this one. Your one and only chance is when Greece goes out, get the island, then you can be the supervillain. Just remember and kill Bond.
Yeah.
That's the thing that everyone seems to forget.
And you might make money doing it, which is even better. So, Mark, I think that's basically all I had here. So, in terms of a summary, we can wrap it up, but I thought just in terms of the last minute or two here that we have, Africa is now, yes, Ashish said it first, India might also be now, perhaps the two of them are doing well. Don't generalize, well, we have 50 shades of Africa, I'm sticking with that. Local plus global, you do need to combine local knowledge and experience and insight with global expertise. Government transparency, continuing to improve throughout the African continent. We can debate whether it's a good thing, but that's okay. Youth demographics.
Unlike this panel, but yeah.
Yes. Youth demographics. And then Mark had his ideas of buying the long-term debt of German industrials that will outlive even the cockroaches, apparently. Mm-hmm. Go along the yen. Long-term mean reversion of GDP growth. What does this say, Mark? You need to get austere with your words.
You wanted to fill up the slide. Don't blame me.
All right, deflation is friendly to bonds, unfriendly to investors. Demographics matter. In fact, this is interesting. All three of us touched on demographics. Yeah. And I think this actually is an insight that we should all pay attention to and not get lost among the 15 points here. Demographics is destiny. It affects what the future will look like. And so we should all pay attention to that. Population meets income. I'm concerned with what I think is a protein boom, putting pressure on the ag value chain. China grows, even if it's slower. India is now, albeit second to Africa, apparently, chronologically. Robots and robotics, generally, automation, deflationary force. And then, of course, if you want to be a supervillain hero and make money while doing so, buy an island. So I think that's basically, we have that last slide for, put one more slide up there.
That's us.
That's, oh, so that's it. So we thought we'd change our titles from thinker, advisor, doer. I think Mark would change it to something else.
Have you got the slide? Yes.
Oh, there we go.
Basically, I obviously really would rather be a trader, so I'm open to offers. And it seems to me that rather than the consigliere, ultimately, the real thinker here is perhaps, no, you're the thinker. You're actually the investor, but you're also the big thinker. And in fact, what does that leave you?
The moderator.
The moderator. Let's give it up for the moderator.
So,